by telling you a few words about this honorable member of the conference, Professor John Lotz, who came to England a few years ago in 1966 from Australia as a medical graduate who wanted to go to postgraduate surgical studies. He became a fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons in 1970, and I suppose you are a British citizen.
Yes.
Of course. I would call him the grandpa of this conference, which would create some confusion because I already declared myself grandma. So I will say a very young spirit who was with us from the beginning. So he is one of the oldest members of the organizing committee. You'll probably see the same strategy as we've seen with the other conferences, pretending to read Lewis through the lenses of the common reader. His speeches usually added extraordinary order and clarity to our perception of Lewis's universe. Let's see if this is the case today as well. So Professor John Lotz, I forgot to tell you that he was associated with Iași in a very concrete way, professionally speaking, as an associate professor at the Medical University of Iași. So,
Great. Come on. Speak. Funcționează? Da, mulțumesc. So, just a minute. We are here. So, bună dimineața still for another 35 minutes. And I want to speak to you about Lewis from the point of view of a reader, mainly. I certainly don't regard myself as a great intellectual, but I am a great appreciator of a great intellect when I read him. So, I've called this a giant reborn, and we'll see what that actually means in practice. He was born, Charles Staple Lewis, on the 29th of November, 1898. It sounds a long time ago, doesn't it? It is. The second son of the Lewis family. Warren, who he called Warnie, was his brother, older brother, and called him Jack. And he would prove to be a very unusual child. Are we right? Yeah, there we are. Good. We're on. His father, Albert Lewis, was a solicitor, and he and his wife, Florence, lived in a large house in Belfast in Northern Ireland. His parents had many books in the house, not children's books, but Lewis got into reading them at a very early age, and that shows as he went on. He and his brother actually wrote a book themselves called Boxing about talking animals. Does that ring any bells? Yes. And it was later rescued by Walter Hooper and eventually published in 1985. If it hadn't been for Walter, it would have disappeared forever, like a lot of other things. More of that later. His family attended what sounds like a very traditional church. Probably not attractive to young children and certainly not to adolescents. This was quite common in churches in Britain in those days, and I suspect in churches all over the world. They were not very child and adolescent friendly. And I have a suspicion when I read the Screwtape Letters, the references in there are to this sort of church. I was at one when I was younger, and I recognized some of the people in the book. The lady with the hat. and the one who sang too loudly, and others. Very much feet on the ground, and I think that came from Lewis's negative experience of church. This problem was addressed many years later in North London by Albert Kirstin, who was a young pastor, and he started a Bible class for teenage boys, which was amazing in its effect. It is still going, and in fact it would be my own entry into Christianity 50 years later. He started in 1906, and I came to faith in Australia through the Crusaders Union. Mr. Lewis wanted his boys to be educated well, which meant in England. That was a major journey for the Lewis boys, by ship to Liverpool, and then by at least one, usually two trains in the direction of London. And he started in 1908 at the Wynyard School, which had its problems. It was badly run, it was failing, and it actually closed down not long after he went there, with the result that he returned to Ireland briefly for education, and then in 1911 moved back to England to Malvern College, which gets very bad press in his biography. It was rather an elitist school, and it was not a school of the Lewis style. It wasn't him. And his father then organised for him to go for private education in 1914 with the great knock, as he used to call him, W.T. Kirkpatrick. He was a very stimulating teacher, and Lewis loved him. And he worked him hard, but he was an atheist. And Lewis finished there in 1916 as an unusual adolescent. His education had gone well at that point. He was brilliant academically, but not in mathematics, and I sympathize with him. I am not either. And he was worried that that would influence his getting into Oxford. But basically the job that the great knock had to do was to get him ready to go to Oxford. Lewis became an atheist aged 16, but he was always looking for what he called joy, whatever that might mean. It meant something about fulfillment, meaningful life, satisfying living, and he wasn't finding it. He explored many philosophies, as outlined later in Surprised by Joy, and in 1916 he travelled to Oxford by train for his entry interview. He brought a book at the station bookstall as he went through, and it was Fantastes by MacDonald, and he didn't realise at the time what a dangerous purchase this was, because it had a Christian message, and he didn't spot it. He got to Oxford all right for his visit, had his interview, but his education at that point was stopped by the arrival of the First World War, and he was conscripted into the army. Then he was injured near Arras. Sorry, I've missed a thing here. Injured near Arras, and repatriated, and eventually taken on at Oxford because he was no longer fit for military service. And so he started as an Oxford student. His education continued, and he continued reading. And that's important in the life of Lewis. He was a great reader, not just a great writer. 1919 saw him graduate with first-class honours, triple first as they were called, first-class honours in all subjects. An intellectual giant, but still personally uncertain, still seeking joy. So he was seeking. His first book was published in 1919, Spirits in Bondage, a book of poetry, followed a few years later by Dimer in 1926. I'm not a poetry man, I haven't read them, maybe you have, but I've not heard people say a lot of positive things about them. And I think Lewis wasn't really a poet either, not in that sense. In 1926, he was elected as a Don, as we heard earlier on, in Oxford, and his job then was teaching students, particularly in English language and literature. But he started making good friends. Good friends are important, and they would turn out to be more significant for him than he realised at the start. He included Tolkien, Owen Barfield, Hugo Dyson. He liked them and he respected them. They were pleasant and interesting people, but they were dangerous. They were all Christians. And he didn't realise it at the time. That came later. And he read and remembered also many other writers who also were Christians. One was Chesterton, MacDonald, who we've heard about already, and many medieval and Renaissance writers. The Inklings would come later. And then there were two dramatic events. I need to go back, yes. The first one was a geographical one. And Magdalen College, where he lived in, was the place where he was during the week, and then at the weekends he would go to Headington, a village to the east side of Oxford where his official address was, if you like. And in 1929 something happened. So here we are at Magdalen College, and he would go down to the bus stop at the Headington Road and board the bus, of which there were plenty. They have all sorts of different colours now, but he would sit upstairs at the front so he could see where he was going. I do that when I get into a double-decker bus as well. And as you leave along the Headington Road, the road disappears into the trees. And as you go on further, it becomes even more different. It becomes steeper. And these aren't just trees at the side. As you can see up here, there's a bridge, and all this is rock, and the road has been cut out of the rock, and it's quite narrow, and it's almost like a tunnel with no roof. And it gets steeper and feels rather oppressive. At the top, it gets flatter and opens out into Headington Village, which has changed hugely since then, because that was about a century ago. It's much more crowded and much more traffic now than when he was there. And I've got a sort of a theory which I'd like to share with you, because something happened to him in the top of that bus that day. It was the end of the week. He was tired. He was heading home, as one does, for a quiet weekend and getting ready for the next one. And the bus went up the hill through this almost narrow tunnel, and as it levelled out, it became almost a relaxation. Excuse me. And then he was almost near home, unwinding already. And then something happened to him. He suddenly became a theist. He believed again that there was a God. Something had happened don't ask me for details, in that journey, that day, and he made not a reversion, but a return to what he'd left at the age of 16. A complex releasing had happened. He hadn't been looking for it, he hadn't been expecting it, but when he got home, he prayed, and then he started exploring. He went to his college chapel when he was there, and also his local church, which was Holy Trinity, Headington. This is a very typical English village church. And interesting, Lewis is still there, so to speak. It became his spiritual home. He would now be free to start rethinking what faith in God meant. And a few weeks ago, I was given a present, a C.S. Lewis Bible. Interesting. It was too big to bring with me. It's huge and heavy. But Lewis obviously started reading his Bible again, and with his proficiency in Greek, that would have been very helpful, particularly with the New Testament. And the Bible, when you open it, has many Lewis quotations in the place of the Bible where they fit. I haven't read them all yet, but there's a bit of work for me to be doing. And here was Lewis developing in his thinking as he was in his reading. Interestingly, the editors of that version of the Bible, some of them were actually in the past speakers at this event, particularly Joe Rigney. Then more travel, the second dramatic event 2 years later, on a motorcycle, I think probably with a sidecar, with his brother Warney driving it and going to Whipsnade Zoo about 100 kilometres away. I don't know whether what happened subsequently was to do with the nature of Warney's driving. It may have been. But by the time they reached the zoo, his faith actually had progressed, and he believed that Jesus was the Son of God. He had moved from a theist to being a Christian. There are some similarities in this story with another person who features in the New Testament, a seeker. And his name was Nicodemus, a Jewish leader, and he'd been watching and listening to what Jesus was doing and saying. And something was happening in his thinking. And he went to see Jesus and asked him about it. The interesting thing is, he went at night. Was he afraid? Was he embarrassed? Was he just too busy to go in the daytime? But we read about him in St. John's Gospel, where Jesus starts off by speaking to him and giving an answer to a question he had not actually asked. The story goes, Nicodemus says, "Rabbi, we know that you're a teacher come from God, for no one can do these miracles that you do unless God is with him." And Jesus answered him, sick, "Truly I say to you, unless one is born again, he cannot enter the kingdom of God." And Nicodemus said to him, "How can a man be born when he's old?" And Jesus answered him, and this is where it gets interesting, that which is born of the flesh is flesh, but that which is born of the Spirit is spirit. He needed to take a vital step in his thinking. And the story goes on, where Jesus teaches more about himself. God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life. And so it had happened with Lewis too. He hadn't been looking, he hadn't been expecting, and if you like, God dropped the bomb on him, which changed his life. The negative spell of atheism was broken. Joy had arrived as a new life with spiritual dimensions. The giant indeed had been reborn. I need to move on a bit because the time is disappearing, I think, isn't it? Yeah. And he was now transformed in his thinking, released. He was now a very dangerous man for atheists because he knew all the arguments, he knew all the weakness, he'd been there. And he knew the ultimate futility of it, no joy. He was also transformed in his communicating. He shared his new thinking in lecturing and writing. A huge volume and variety of things followed. He'd found joy in dimensions he'd not even expected and would be able to help other people to discover as well. And indeed, his writing was transformed. His first Christian book, The Pilgrim's Regress, came in 1933. I read it rather later than that. And when I read it, I couldn't understand it until I read it a second time. And I realized it's actually a mythopoeic autobiography. And it tells his story. The very place he was trying to avoid was the very place that he was led to. The allegory of love was referred to earlier. He was writing textbooks as well, and that textbook was being used in my university in Australia when I was a student. That was in the English department. I was in the medical faculty. And new opportunities came. We've heard mention of the British Broadcasting Corporation in World War II, and as part of their war effort to raise national morale, he was asked to do a series of lectures under the general topic of, and it's a bit of a mouthful, right and wrong as a clue to the meaning of the universe. Wow. And eventually that was published as Mere Christianity, which I read in my first year of university. It had been published just a few years before and it hit the youth group in my church like a bomb. It made us rethink all sorts of things. It was a very significant book. And I need to move on. Where are we? The Weight of Glory followed in the university church. And I was going to talk a bit more about that, but I think the time has run away with us. It's based on a verse in 2 Corinthians where St. Paul compares his past life with his new life. The past was trivial. The new was massive and magnificent. He wrote for a huge variety of readers, from children to academics, in a wide range of genres, and all sorts of things followed. He left us with a huge literary legacy to discover, read, enjoy, and live out. And much of this was preserved due to the efforts of his assistants, Walter Hooper, who I twice interviewed for this symposium in the past on audio and video. His English style is precise, memorable, and stimulating, and intellectually and personally so. We can all be delightfully surprised by joy as we discover it through Lewis's writings. Rather like an Old Testament character, Abel, who was murdered by his brother, we're told through faith, though he died, he still speaks. And rather like Lewis, the giant lives on. What will we as individuals discover this week from him. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lotz. And now we'll make it more informal. We'll be sitting strategically. Let me introduce the second speaker of the second panel, Kirstin Jeffrey Johnson. I've made some progress in pronouncing her first name. I hope it's noticeable. Internationally known as a George MacDonald scholar, she has been with us from the second conference from 2014, not only as a vivid presence, but also a supporter, a counselor, an inspiration in many ways. I still browse through The Golden Key by George MacDonald, with which we initiated our collection of fairy tales for children of all ages. So the children of all ages participating in the conference who can read Romanian can enjoy a collection of fairy tales in translation. There's a lot that we can say about Kirstin. She's on the advisory board of Inklings Journal 7, a founding board member of the C.S. Lewis and Kindred Spirits Society of Eastern and Central Europe, that's us. Co-chair of the George MacDonald Society, and a few things that you'll definitely like. She's passionate about integrating ecological care in local community and local community with academia. And she's very firm on the following, but she lives on a farm and loves enticing academic colleagues into the outdoors. Since she's very busy outside on the farm, let her sit now and present her speech.
Thank you, Dr. Elbu. Yeah, forgive me for sitting. I will last longer if I do so. And is that one set up? Okay, thank you very much. There we go. I'd like to tell you a story today. A story that almost no student of English literature knows. It is the story of how the discipline of English literature began. Now, it seems fairly crazy that a discipline that was shaped precisely with the intent to study the stories of a culture would have forgotten its very own origin tale. And yet, I have never once met a teacher or professor of English literature who could tell me how the discipline, the one to which belong C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, one could argue Charles Williams, etc., actually began. I didn't know this myself until I started to more closely study Lewis's spiritual and literary mentor, George MacDonald. Let's see if this, there we go, there he is. It was only then that I came to realize not just how young the discipline was, but also how radical it was that George MacDonald was one of its earliest practitioners, and that he had stepped into it because he believed that stories could enchant people into change. I realize that some of you are only familiar with MacDonald because Lewis called him his master and claimed that reading MacDonald had baptized his imagination. Others of you, however, have studied, read, and even taught about MacDonald for years. And so I've printed off a short biography, the George MacDonald Society biography, to peruse. A lot of misinformation on MacDonald shaped early scholarship on him. And although that's radically changed over the past 20 years, many non-specialists have not yet caught up. There is merit in his common assignation as, I have to stick my hand out here, the grandfather of fantasy. But just like the Inklings who succeeded him, fantasy was but a portion of his work. He was also briefly a church minister, but whilst he gave guest sermons throughout his life, being a minister was a flash of time in his 20s. What is too seldom mentioned, but absolutely central to understanding both MacDonald and his influence upon C.S. Lewis, is that MacDonald was one of the earliest teachers committed to the teaching discipline of English literature. a vocation to which he dedicated over 40 years of his life. And he did not just teach literature in the classroom and lecture hall, he incessantly taught literature from the page as well. Even before his short clergy career, MacDonald's father had recognized in his son and encouraged the beginnings of this lifelong vocation. That this passion to teach manifested in his writing as well as from behind the podium is a key factor in understanding both the man and his work. It helps explain his vocational attitude and philosophy of life, as well as how he influenced those others. MacDonald's decision to commit vocationally to this discipline, teaching his students the stories of English literature and how to read and critique them, was at that time a radical choice to participate in social reform, a choice informed by the social justice passions of the founders of the discipline. Who'd have thought? These reformers, A.J. Scott and F.D. Morris, were MacDonald's personal, literary, and theological mentors and friends. They fought numerous social justice battles throughout their lives, but arguably their greatest inroads were in the field of education, and education through literature in particular. Their motivation, their pedagogy, and their output were directly shaped by their Trinitarian theology and its emphasis on relationship, revelation, and transformation, the manifestations of which deeply impacted MacDonald's own teaching and writing, and in consequence, those he influenced. C.S. Lewis is a clear beneficiary of and participant in that inheritance, and my guess is that many of you are too. This talk is an introduction to these teachers and how they influenced Lewis, the scholar Lewis called his own master, Lewis's words, and teacher, George MacDonald. For those of you in the room who teach British or English literature, allow me to introduce you to your founding fathers, A.J. Scott and F.D. Morris. Now, at the beginning of the 19th century, access to education was very limited in England. It was the preserve of the privileged. Free public education, even at the primary level, was not mandated until 1899. Post-secondary education was the domain of a very specific elite. The options were Oxford or Cambridge. And to both attend and graduate from either of these required being male, having sufficient funds, and being a member of the Church of England, an Anglican. Otherwise, forget it. A group of students at Cambridge were dissatisfied with this, not only for an exclusion which they deemed socially and ethically problematic, but also for how that exclusion negatively impacted their own education. Their culturally distinctive insistence upon the importance of respecting and learning from alternative voices set apart this group that became known as the Cambridge Apostles. And their most influential member in shaping the ethos of unity and diversity was a student named Frederick Denison Morris. Morris and his fellow students held that insightful understanding and consequential progress could only come through respectful attention to multiple perspectives and ideas. With youthful idealism, they believed in having a cohesive worldview, one that informed not only how one thought and spoke and argued, but also how one acted out in life. They asserted that what one believed theologically, philosophically, and how one worked, and even how one played, should all hold together, each aspect informing the other. A realization of that vision would demand facilitation of and participation in educational and civic reform for all peoples, regardless of class, religion, or gender. And these students were convinced that one of the most effective mobilizers of such reform was the medium of literature. Yet their conviction highlighted another dissatisfaction with the education system, for they felt that their university, and Oxford as well, sorely lacked in literary education. The literature discussed in classes was primarily classical, never British. And so this group of students attempted to compensate by this is a group of students, by assigning and reading essays on their own to each other, discussing British literature at length, exploring recent European literary movements and reforms. Morris was not the only of these students to remain committed to this idealism long after graduation, but he was arguably the most effective. For the remainder of his life, he would write articles, chapters, books that embodied those early ideals. He helped found and taught at numerous institutions that provided post-secondary education for the working classes, for women, and for non-Anglicans. Institutions that would eventually bear such names as the University of London and the University of Manchester. Morris's enthusiasm drew others to participate in his education and reform projects. Diverse personalities such as someone we've seen already today, Thomas Carlyle, Thackeray, Charles Kingsley. And whilst in London, Morris joined a growing number of equally diverse intellectual elite, such as Julius Hare, Francis Newman, Thomas Hughes, Carl Gutzlaff, Anthony Norris Groves, Henry Crabb Robinson, the Gaskells, the Carlyles, the Wedgwoods, who were attracted to the lectures of a Scottish teacher with a strikingly similar principles to those of Morris's own. His name was Alexander John Scott, and this is a younger picture of the gent we saw earlier. Like Morris and his fellow Cambridge students, Scott was arguing for an integrated, holistic worldview. And he too was adamant that reform would come through historic and literary education, a belief that he insisted was rooted in biblical precedents. Scott's own learning was astounding. An able lecturer in theology, philosophy, politics, history, languages, science, and literature. Fluent not only in classical and biblical languages, but also able to read Middle and Old English, French, Italian, German, Old German, Sanskrit, and more. As regards his critical abilities, Thomas Carlyle and John Ruskin were amongst the many who called him the best Dante scholar of the day. Scott was also determinedly Trinitarian, which was of no small import to Morris, who had himself carefully chosen that position as a young adult despite being raised Unitarian by his father, who was a Unitarian minister. In A.J. Scott, Morris found a compatriot, a teacher such as he had wished to have had at Cambridge. Scott had come to London as a minister for Scottish immigrants who had moved to England. He carried on in that role for some years, but almost immediately began giving concurrent lectures in his local parish, down in the dockyards as well. As an immigrant, Scott had been shocked by many of the contrasts between England and Scotland, but perhaps most strikingly in the realm of education. Scotland's centuries-old education system had not only resulted in a much higher literacy rate amongst both men and women, rural and urban, than in England, but Scottish schools were also much more integrated socially. And the universities, twice as many as in England since the 1500s, were intentionally structured to facilitate a socially diverse student body, even farm kids. Nor did they restrict the degrees to one denomination. Both within and without the education system, the sense of identity from a familiarity with one's own culture and literature was much stronger in Scotland. And Scott was deeply concerned by the consequences of its absence amongst all the classes in London. Scott believed that to better know one's heritage, the stories of one's culture, of one's faith, of one's community, was to better know oneself, which as a pastor he believed would necessarily deepen and enrich one's relationship with God, in addition to improving relationships with one's neighbors. Struck that this lack of rootedness was not only endemic in the working classes of London, which is a predictable byproduct of the Industrial Revolution, but amongst all classes, even those who had degrees from Oxford and Cambridge, Scott began to teach in the fashionable public lecture halls as well. Overview courses on England's philosophers and theologians, courses on English literature and church history, from medieval and Renaissance literature right up to contemporary authors. Scott spent hours delving through long-forgotten texts in the British Library and translating them for his audiences, introducing them to Bede and Ælfric, Beowulf and Chaucer, discussing the importance of Milton and Wycliffe, Sidney and Spenser. He argued that the better the English knew their own literature, the better readers they would become of other literatures, such as the works of Goethe and Dante. Polymaths who considered themselves uniquely educated in literature, such as John Ruskin and Thomas Carlyle, numbered amongst Scott's most enthusiastic fans. Eventually, George MacDonald, when a student in his early 20s, would also attend such lectures by Scott. But long before that happened, it was Morris who found himself captivated. In Scott, Morris had found someone equally passionate, even more widely read, and just as convinced that these were matters deeply theological, a kindred compelled to action. Scott and Morris ended up being involved in many projects together. And you should ask Margie McCarran over there, who wrote her PhD partially on Scott, about some of those projects. I'm very excited about that because there are not many PhDs out there on Scott. They would teach at each other's institutions, connect each other to fellow educators, artists, authors. They would write on each other's behalf. Together, they rallied colleagues to fight various ravages of the Industrial Revolution and of the establishment upon working classes, women, and non-Anglicans, whether Christian or not. They did not agree on everything, but this did not impede their relationship. For diverse community bound together by the grace of and in obedience to the triune God was their shared central tenet. Arguably, their greatest collaborative efforts was this facilitation of the emerging discipline of English literature. Affected by the movement to which these men belonged, founders of the new institution called King's College London decided to figure out what it would be like to turn lectures such as Scott's into part of the university curriculum. So in 1840, Morris was appointed to the new chair of English history and literature. Whilst the second person to fill this position, he was the first to teach the course as it had been intended, integrated and contextual, history and literature each illuminating the other. His student self would have been elated. Modeling his lectures on what he'd learned from Scott, he began with a talk on the growth of the English nation and its literature. Maintaining their formal study of literature also required the practice of literary criticism. And Morris drew his students into an engagement with not just the texts, but the minds behind the texts that they studied. 8 years later, when Morris founded Queen's College for Women, Scott stepped into that literature position. The committee had tried several other people first, but thus far only Morris had actually taught literature, and as had been their vision. They'd been pleased with Scott, they were elated with, or they had been pleased with Morris, they were elated with Scott. He exceeded their expectations. And whilst for others, even Morris, teaching of literature had been a side gig, for Scott it was a full-time position. He thus became the first ever full-time English literature professor. Scott and Morris believed that the study of literature would benefit both individuals desirous of practicing the Christian faith as well as those who are not. They refused to chain institutional education to proselytization, though they always hoped that a deeper understanding might draw skeptics in. Regardless of a persisting fear amongst many in the upper classes at that time that educating the working class was dangerous, Morris argued that literary study was a natural vehicle for both entertaining and educating the masses by appealing to the innate powers of sympathy that guided their conduct and formed their imagination. Christians particularly needed to be made aware of their social responsibility and of the bond they shared with all humanity. Literature in the service of altruism could accomplish that. Morris concurred with Scott's argument that knowing one's story, one's lineage, scripturally, historically, culturally, and in terms of the literature that's evoked by all three, could deepen self-understanding, individually and communally, as well as understanding of others and of God. Thus, although uniquely positioned to teach multiple literatures, you heard how many languages that Scott could speak and read in, the focus of their efforts was upon this new practice of teaching England's literature. They were convinced that doing so with integrity, could lead readers into healthier relationships, even on an international level, not least as students learned how deeply English literature had been enriched by that of other nations. Whilst Scott and Morris encouraged attentiveness to and discussion of internal characteristics and devices employed in a text, such as theme, pattern, rhetoric, symbolism, irony, imagery, they suggested that preferential status should be given to the work in and of itself. To kill the sense of enchantment of a story that invites one into a different realm, all for the sake of identifying technique, would be to betray the text itself. It might also extinguish the transformative potential of that text. Scott and Morris were more interested in a piece of writing as, to anachronistically borrow Tolkien's term, subcreation. As such, they taught that both its conception and inception should also be considered. For Scott and Morris, a text cannot stand independent of the human from whose lived experience that text was issued. That was an integral aspect of their literary critique, and thus of how they taught. For them, this was a theological mandate. To know something of the author and of how a piece of work came about is to understand that work better, just as to know something of God and of the creation of the world is to understand creation better. They considered a text a unified whole, but one that, like a human, could be even better understood for knowing its external relationships. They did not view any work as self-contained. Both the words on the page as well as the context that produced and surrounded them were important. To study this, for them, was to study English literature. It should also be noted that Scott and Morris did not believe that pursuing critical study in this manner could ever lead to an exclusively correct reading of a text. But they did believe that the effort would prove enlightening. They also taught the engagement of different readers with a text could enable the apprehension of new truths, as a text always contains more meanings than one reader can discover. They maintained that a text even holds more than its author intends, though that does not therefore render the declaration of intent by the author invaluable. The reader is never more important than the author, but is rather a participant in a conversation proffered by the author. The more respect and effort at understanding put into practice, the more successful the communication. The plea for attentiveness to the text, and when possible to the wider corpus, and even the biography of the author, emphasized Scott and Morris's perspective that engagement with the text was an engagement with a communication from another human being. It reflected the conviction that it is a Christian responsibility to try to understand those with whom one engages as best as possible. When teaching, Morris frequently referenced Scott's adage that a book is the expression of the living thoughts of living persons. He himself wrote that authors and readers exist together within an organic culture. A close reading not only engaged with the text, but with the mind of the person who wrote the text. Attentive reading was essentially an opportunity to make contact with the great imaginations of the past. Scott paraphrased from John Milton, "These books were not absolutely dead things, but the precious lifeblood of master spirits, embalmed and treasured to a life beyond life." Thus, not only is a reader to probe the author's intent, whilst remaining aware that there may be more present in the text than intended, but to do so with the eschatological awareness that one may yet meet the author, an enchantment that extended far beyond the book's cover. Morris wrote that the best kind of literary criticism delights to draw forth the sense and beauty of a book and is able to do so because of the heart of the critic is in sympathy with the heart of the writer. You literary critics out there, this is like the beginning of the discipline. This is where we started. We strayed a long way from there. He also wrote that there is a principle, which I wish should always be taken for granted. And that is that if we read and interpret carefully in an attitude of cheerfulness and obedience to the Holy Spirit, our work can thrive. But if we are resistant to that obedience or read with pride, our work will inevitably be marred. That's something to write above your desk, again, for those of us who are teachers and critics. I wish I had read that before I'd started reviewing other people's books. Attentive teaching, and thus literary criticism itself, should be conducted with graciousness, and was most successful, most insightful, if done under the guiding spirit, or the guiding inspiration of the Holy Spirit. The potential conversation between author and reader divinely mediated. Both men taught that practicing such an attitude in their engagement with other minds would increase the possibility of common understanding and unity generally, a consistent goal throughout their efforts at social reform as well as in their pulpit preaching. What an exhortation from these first literature professors to increase the possibility of common understanding and unity. Scott and Morris also encouraged these students to likewise pay attention to the confluence of ideas throughout literature, arguing that the better one knew Scripture and the voices that both preceded and followed it, and the better that one knew the voices that entered into intentional conversation, the better able one would be to identify these intersections of ideas and thus insights of timeless importance. Attending to such confluences in the long conversation within literature through the centuries could enable revelations of truth. This proposal, the attentiveness to voices of those who had gone before, whether of distant or of immediate past, could better inform readers as they stepped into the future, was really a provocative concept in Victorian England, a culture so enamored with progress. But Scott and Morris believed that the willingness to apprehend and respond to perceived truths would necessarily invite transformation. And the better equipped one was to understand the text, the communication, the greater the possibility that one's insight would prove transformative to oneself. This might manifest in a seemingly simple change in perspective, finding trees more mysterious, goodness more attractive, hobbits more heroic. It might mean a shift in one's prejudice, sufficient to incur approval of education for women, the poor, or even Baptists and atheists. It might evoke action, such as writing a response or changing a career plan. It might even prove as radical as to provoke a shift in theology. The study of Dante, hide that next picture. The study of Dante had informed Scott's reflections on many of these ideas, but also on the very concept of reading and teaching literature in the vernacular, the everyday language of the people on the street. Dante was a pioneer in choosing to write an epic work in a language that could be read by more than just the educated elite. In De Vulgare Eloquentia, Dante explains that he wanted his poem to be accessed by the greatest possible number of readers without distinction of class or sex. Scott argued that Dante's choice changed the course of Western literature, as other subsequent authors evaluated and began to follow suit. In his lectures, Scott repeatedly discussed the decisions by Alfred and Chaucer and Milton and Wycliffe and Sidney and Luther to likewise make literature, stories of identity and faith, ideas of theological and philosophical import, accessible. These examples fortified Scott's own argument for the importance of teaching the literature of the people in the language of the people, the discipline of English literature, but only insofar as they emulated a much older example, the incarnation of the vernacular Word of God. Scott declared that it's an important quotation here, the humanity of Christ is that which translates the ineffable language of the Most High into man's native tongue. For Scott, this precedence obliged him to translate the once vernacular English literature that was no longer accessible to the working classes who came to hear him teach, equipping them via the language that they could access so that they might be able to read their own literature themselves someday, equipping not only through academic assistance, but also by such means as to help establish truly public lending libraries and affordable magazines. For Morris, this precedence informed his establishment of working men's colleges and his crafting of sermons. Reminiscent of Ignatian exercises, really, Morris's sermons that endeavored to help the listener or reader step into the biblical stories. And although neither man published successful popular vernacular writings, this precedence also informed their eager encouragement of their student, George MacDonald, to do just that. MacDonald had followed their lead into becoming a classroom teacher of literature to all the categories of students previously excluded, as well as becoming a popular lecturer of English literature to the general public in multiple countries, in the thousands. MacDonald additionally achieved what they had not, writing vernacular literature for the general populace, popular literature that consciously participated in literature's long conversation. Sermons, realistic novels, fairy tales, fantasies, essays, poetry. He consciously invited his everyday readers to join into these conversations. While sufficient to entertain on a surface level, these fiction books have layers and layers of literary concepts and relationship for those who choose to look closely. Even the shortest or goofiest of MacDonald's stories are crammed with literary legacy and always from a multiplicity of texts. And they were remarkably successful. In a foreshadowing of Lewis's own accolades, MacDonald referred to Scott as both his master and his teacher. MacDonald was, like Scott, a polyglot, capable of reading and writing in numerous ancient and modern languages. He was as intrigued by the sciences as by the arts. Like Scott, he was a gatherer of diverse persons and was a counseling confidant of many. And like Scott, he valued hospitality in one's conversations and in one's relationships as much as in one's home. Like Morris, later his minister, when MacDonald converted to Anglicanism, he taught fellow students when yet a student himself, and supplemented his own education when the Institute seemed lacking. He also likewise took on the editorship of different journals in an effort to disseminate affordable learning to a wider populace. Both Scott and Morris were significant teachers, chosen mentors, and adult friends of George MacDonald. They instilled in him a deep conviction of the importance of literature and the need of people to be storied, to be enchanted. He willingly dedicated the majority of his life to the practice of teaching of literature, both from the podium and the page. From his very first novel, Fantastes, he fully embodies that enchantment. Scott and Morris's concern and passion that England learn her stories is reflected in MacDonald's choice of lecture topics. For although all his writing was shaped by the authors of varied cultural backgrounds, in his hundreds, if not thousands of lectures, many of which were written up by journalists, thus increasing his audience exponentially, MacDonald always spoke on British writers, such as, and I've kind of lost my correct slides there, but such as Chaucer and Shakespeare, Sidney, Tennyson, Hood, Coleridge, Burns, Milton, Wordsworth, with the exception of only one, Dante. All British except for Dante. True to his mentors, his lectures never considered the literature without considering the human who had penned it. MacDonald's essays and even commentary in his novels likewise reveal that he researched well the lives of these authors he admired and was eager to introduce. But MacDonald's explicit literary criticism does not appear solely in his expository works. It appears, sometimes in expository fashion, in much of his fiction as well. Lectures on Sidney and Dante. This is an over-eager flipper here. Lectures on Sidney and Dante, both authors referenced in almost everything that MacDonald wrote. Discussions of The Rime of the Ancient Mariner and Paradise Lost. Entire chapters given over to exegetical discussions of Isaiah, or to tracing the metaphor of metamorphosis from Greek myth, Psyche, through to Paul. There we go, there's Paul, on up to Blake and Ruskin. Plato, Boethius, Langland, mystery plays, Mallory, Spencer, Shakespeare, Herbert, Bundan, Goethe. These are but a few of the writers and works that appear repeatedly throughout the very fabric of MacDonald's fiction. He pulls their phrases and their images and ideas into conversation with each other explicitly and implicitly. And in his essay, The Imagination, Its Functions and Its Culture, MacDonald discusses using a story as a spiritual scaffolding or skeleton. Those main ideas upon which the shape is constructed and around which the rest group as ministering dependencies. The practice is one he utilizes often, explaining in such critical engagement with the art of previous sub-creators is itself high art. So engaging with the art of previous sub-creators is itself high art. And key to understanding Lewis's use of the word mythopoet, that which he claimed may even be the greatest of arts, and of which he said MacDonald is the greatest genius. MacDonald's position with the creativity, I'm being thrown off by the slide there. MacDonald's position was that creativity could only occur relationally. And that's really important, that creativity could only occur relationally. Art could not exist outside of a relational framework. The canon indicated that truly great literature was born of highly informed and intentional engagement with the works of others. In his collection of English devotional literature, MacDonald calls it an antiphonal response. In his own crafting of even a seemingly simple children's tale, such as The Princess and Curdie, it proves to be, in addition to a successful entertainment, the book's never been out of print, an exploration of biblical narrative, Isaiah, a questioning of cultural identities, such as the newly formed self-help movement and Adam Smith's popular laissez-faire, a deft challenge to the literary and biblical criticism of Matthew Arnold, particularly as expressed in Literature and Dogma and Arnold's Isaiah commentaries, and an homage to typological convergences from Greek myth and Christian art traditions up through Coleridge and Shelley. He even slips in nods to some recent geological treaties, all in this simple fairy tale. MacDonald intentionally enticed his readership into deeper and broader reading of literature, both contemporary and ancient, national and international. Whether the literature he referenced was familiar and easy to access or more obscure, he believed that it would give shape and depth to his own printed communication. Each text is, because he was a consummate teacher, always full of introductions. He sees his prime responsibility as teacher, critic, author, for him none distinct from the other, to be a facilitator of relationship. It is little wonder that libraries are the setting for so many important relational engagements in his novels. Ever a student of Scott and Morris, MacDonald had wanted his own students to remember that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and of Jacob was also the God of Sidney, of Hooker, of Herbert, and of all teachers since. He explained in books that in books one could find fellow pilgrims, kindred spirits, intellectual sparring partners, even old friends, a community of readers. He shared the eschatological perspective suggested by his mentors, which heightened the demand not only of responsibility to the text, but also to the very author upon whom one might presume to write or lecture. In this facilitation of relationship betwixt my readers and the writers from whom I have quoted, modeled to him by Scott, MacDonald renders it impossible to conduct the type of exclusive close reading encouraged by his contemporary Matthew Arnold, one that only considers a text within itself in order to produce a single clear sense. Rather, MacDonald continuously drives his readers out with his frequent quotations and references, even in his fantasy. He repeatedly explains that a book draws the reader into a world envisioned by another in order that the reader might be better prepared for having related with the communications of that author to then venture out into yet other worlds. As the character in MacDonald's novel Lilith, Mr. Raven croaks in exasperation to the protagonist, a book is a door in and therefore a door out. Just as MacDonald is insistent that no book can exist or come into existence in isolation from the others, that writing is born out of the relationship from which the author is grown, forged in community, literary and otherwise, whether in reaction, response, or both. He is insistent that a reader is the same. MacDonald declared that his prime intent in writing was to wake up his readers to the proffered revelation of the divine imagination. He believed that it is in response to a revelation received as a result of relationship that transformation can occur. That, say, a reader might wake up, think new things, take new action, be re-enchanted. His delight in sharing the intertextual interweaving of universal truths throughout great literature was part of his inheritance from Scott and Morris, and he hoped that of all subsequent literature teachers. Unfortunately, C.S. Lewis did not have MacDonald as a teacher in person, as MacDonald had Scott and Morris. And Lewis's own fairly flawed biography of MacDonald indicates that he was unaware of MacDonald's actual profession. But Lewis still benefited from MacDonald's astonishing breadth and depth of literary knowledge, as well as his embedded pedagogy. Throughout Lewis's literature, his fiction, his criticism, his sermons, his talks, the influence of MacDonald's teaching is everywhere evident, as is therefore the legacy of Scott and Morris. And for those who take the time to read Lewis's handwritten notes, especially in such texts as A Dish of Orts and Unspoken Sermons, MacDonald's books, you will see how closely Lewis attends as a reader to his teacher. These pioneers, that's a scary note. These pioneers were determined that their students comprehend that literature is, in its very conception, let alone in its transmittance and apprehension, a communication born of relationship, and in its very conception, a communication born of relationship and a communication which invites participation. This is central to their understanding of how to critique a text. And with the conviction that all humans deserve the opportunity to be such a reader, they founded the discipline of English literature. Scott and Morris advocated MacDonald's translation of this into a cultural vernacular, imaginative collaborations with the antiphonal past to be heard by new audiences. Their investment was not misplaced, for MacDonald's textual teaching did and does wake up consciences. It causes readers to think things for themselves. It baptizes imaginations, transforms and chants the initial intent of the discipline and the potential reward of every teacher of English literature. When in The Great Divorce, some of you can see that, Lewis names his Virgilian guide, but once as George MacDonald, and thereafter and throughout as my teacher, his readers need to consider that this accolade speaks of more than spiritual inspiration. From the moment Lewis picked up MacDonald's fantasies as a teenager, through all his years as a literature teacher, to the last full year of his life when he named Fantasies first amongst any book that shaped his, and this is Lewis's quotation, vocational attitude, that's fantastic, shaped, Lewis says, this is the book that most shaped his vocational attitude and philosophy of life. Lewis was feasting with his teacher in a fulsome company of story stewards who together transcend time and space so that their readers might better know and be known. An enchanted, multidimensional gathering to which we too are invited. Thank you.
Thank you, and see how so MacDonald was mentioned as the first important reading that changed Lewis's, let's say, orientation. Then in the second speech, we heard the full story, and we understand MacDonald's role in the whole career of Lewis. And the third speech is really challenging, exciting, because it's entitled Kicking and Struggling, C.S. Lewis, the Dejected, Reluctant Convert. And the one who's going to present it is Daryl McCarthy, here present, Executive Director of the Leadership Anvil, who has earned important academic degrees in the field of theological studies. And in addition to writing and speaking, he mentors Christian professors and ministry leaders in Europe and beyond. He's been speaking at universities, conferences, and churches globally for more than 30 years, and we are honored by his presence here. So you have a choice of sitting or standing. It's up to you.
Okay, in line with the famous Dr. Chuck White pedagogical principle of standing up for Jesus and yourself, let's stand up for about 10 seconds here so we can be refreshed as we move forward. That's good pedagogy anytime, Chuck. Okay, very good. Okay, that felt good. So we'll do more of that in just a few minutes, so thank you so much. Now, what is one word you could use to describe the change of an obnoxious, egotistical, twisted egghead to a gentle, kind, generous, and thoughtful person? What's one word you could use to describe that? Now, if the change also involves a transformation from being a militant atheist to a committed follower of Jesus, then I'm thinking that one word might work best, namely conversion. So the dramatic transformation of C.S. Lewis, one of the most famous and most beloved authors, is what I want to talk to you for a few minutes today about. Thousands of people around the world of all faiths and no faith love Lewis and love his writing. But it's easy for us, when he is so loved now, to forget what a really bad person he was before this change, what a militant opponent he was to Christianity. So the big question is, what changed? Why? What happened to so radically change this proud, abusive, obnoxious person to being the kind of person we read about today? Now, I would argue that it is impossible to understand C.S. Lewis or his writings without first understanding his conversion. First, his double conversion, as we call it, first to theism, as Michelson described to us this morning, and then his second conversion, as Dr. Lotz was describing, to Christ. It would be like trying to understand 1980s Romania without knowing there was a Ceausescu. Or it would be like trying to understand Michael Jordan without even knowing what a basketball was, or like trying to understand Napoleon if you don't even know where France is. So in the next few minutes, I'd like to look at three things. Number one, what was Lewis like before? What changed? Number two. And then primarily, what are some principles about conversion that we can read from Lewis? So how bad was this Professor X, this Clive Staples Lewis, before his conversion? How bad was he? Well, the answer is pretty bad. He was known for being arrogant and self-centered. When he started as a junior member of a faculty at Oxford, he was proud and combative. Alan Jacobs, in his excellent biography, The Narnian, points out Jack Lewis was a thoroughly obnoxious, arrogant, condescending, intellectual prig. Other than that, he was a great guy, of course. Now, there's some evidence also that pre-conversion he struggled with some sadomasochistic tendencies, and you add on to this the secretive at best, weird and quirky relationship at worst relationship that he had with Mrs. Moore, the mother of his Oxford friend who died in the war. And then add on to that, although he grew up in a Christian home, I just drove past his church in Belfast a few days ago. Even though he grew up in a Christian home, he became a militant atheist and was quite angry at God. So that's number one. What was he like before? Number two, what happened? How did he change? And I really appreciate the prelude that we've had to all this, so I can skip a lot of stuff. But as early as 1920, he had written to a friend that he had to admit that the least objectionable theory was to postulate some sort of God. And then he started realizing there was a shallowness in many of the authors that he had been reading, the people like George Bernard Shaw and H.G. Wells. And he says they seemed a little thin with no depth in them. They were flat, one-dimensional, too simple to capture, and I love these words, the roughness and density of life. And we've already been well introduced then to the key role that major figures like George MacDonald and G.K. Chesterton played in his own conversion. In fact, after reading Chesterton's Everlasting Man, he reluctantly conceded Christianity itself is very sensible apart from its Christianity. I mean, that's classic Lewis. And yet he was often drawn back to his old anger at God and his antagonism toward Christianity. And you have to admit, as Dr. Lotz reminded us, if all you knew about Christianity was what he probably experienced and saw in his local church, then what more is there to do? But he spent much time in introspection. And step by step, he became much more aware of his own self-centeredness and pride. He writes this, "For the first time," he wrote to his friend Arthur Greaves, "I examined myself with a seriously practical purpose, and there I found what appalled me. A zoo of lusts, a bedlam of ambitions, a nursery of fears, a harem of fondled hatreds. My name was Legion." After he became a tutor at Magdalen College, he set about, and as we've been reminded this morning, reading and rereading the Bible, attending church every morning at the morning chapels and then on Sundays. And then in his autobiography, which most of you have read, Surprised by Joy, I can't talk about his conversion without reading this, so you'll understand. "You must picture me alone in that room in Magdalen night after night, feeling whenever my mind lifted even for a second from my work, the steady, unrelenting approach of him whom I so earnestly desired not to meet. That which I greatly feared had at last come upon me. In the Trinity term of 1929, I gave in and admitted that God was God and knelt and prayed. That night, I was the most dejected and reluctant convert in all of England. I did not then see what is now the most shining and obvious thing, the divine humility which will accept a convert even on such terms. But who can truly adore that love which will open the high gates to a prodigal who is brought in kicking, struggling, resentful, and darting his eyes in every direction for a chance of escape? He had made his first conversion to theism. Well, it was 2 years later, and as Dr. Lotz just described to us, he made a later conversion to be a follower of Christ, and he describes that experience as having occurred in the sidecar of the motorcycle with his brother Warren. And a few days later, after that event in late September, he writes on October 1 to his buddy again. He says, I have just passed on from believing in God to definitely believing in Christ, in Christianity. And much of that conversion happened because of friends. Long walk on Addison's Walk there with Dyson and Tolkien and others. And he writes to Greaves, now the story of Christ is simply a true myth, a myth working on us in the same way as the others, but with this tremendous difference that it really happened. And he explained that this is based on, his words, the actual incarnation, crucifixion, and resurrection of Christ. So Lewis was changed. He was radically changed. And Walter Hooper, who's mentioned here several times already, wrote a few months before he died, Lewis struck me as the most thoroughly converted man I had ever met. Eric Routley was an undergraduate at Magdalen, and he actually heard Lewis preach his Weight of Glory sermon in St. Mary's Church. And he'd only met Lewis a few times, but he recalled years later that when listening to him, one felt here was a man who had been truly laid hold of by God and who enjoyed it. Now that's a conversion. So third point, what can we learn from Lewis about conversion? And I originally did this talk just about a year ago on this date. I was asked to speak over in Cluj, give a public lecture at a Humanitas bookstore to help celebrate the 50th anniversary of the publication of Mere Christianity. We learn much about conversion, principles of conversion, through Mere Christianity. And as Chuck has reminded us earlier, much of that is through metaphors. And I think the best summary I've ever seen is by Michael Ward, because he points out that Lewis's nonfiction abounds with similes, metaphors, and analogies. And he gives a number of examples. Here's Ward's words. A brief survey of Mere Christianity supplies the following list of metaphors. Becoming a Christian, passing over from death to life is like joining a campaign of sabotage, like falling at someone's feet or putting yourself in someone's hands, like taking on board fuel and food, which we're all thinking about now, like laying down your rebel arms and surrendering, saying sorry, laying yourself open, turning full speed astern. It is like killing part of yourself, like learning to walk or to write, like buying God a present with his own money. It is like a drowning man clutching at a rescuer's hand, like a tin soldier or statue becoming alive, like waking after a long sleep, like getting close to someone or becoming infected, like dressing up or pretending or play. It is like emerging from the womb or hatching from an egg. It is like a compass needle swinging to the north, or a cottage being built into a palace, or a field being plowed and resown, or a horse turning into a Pegasus, or a greenhouse roof becoming bright in the sunlight. It is like coming around from anesthetic, like coming in out of the wind, like going home. And those are just starters. And then Ward concludes by saying this. Rather than saying, come to Jesus, Lewis is saying, this is what it is like to come to Jesus. If you're not attracted or interested or assisted by this way of putting it, here are a dozen other ways of considering the same thing. So here are some principles that we can learn from Lewis about conversion. Number one, conversion to Jesus can be painful. From Lewis's perspective, the experience of conversion to Christ was definitely, decidedly unpleasant, even though the after effect was wonderful. Mere Christianity explains, I quite agree that the Christian religion is, in the long run, a thing of unspeakable comfort, but it does not begin in comfort. It begins in the dismay I've been describing, and it is no use at all trying to go on to that comfort without first going through that dismay. Now, my guess is that when I talk about painful, you're already going to the voyage of the Dawn Treader when Eustace has become a dragon, and he gets tired of being a dragon and wants to change, and Aslan approaches him, and Eustace comes back to the group later and describes what happens. Then the lion said, "Then you will have to let me undress you. I was afraid of the claws, but I was pretty nearly desperate now." The very first tear he made was so deep that I thought it had gone right into my heart. And when he began pulling the skin off, it hurt worse than anything I've ever felt. The only thing that made me able to bear it was just the pleasure of feeling the stuff peel off. Well, he peeled the beastly stuff right off. Then he caught hold of me. I didn't much like that, for I was very tender underneath now, but I had no skin on, and threw me into the water. It smarted like anything, but only for a moment. After that, it became perfectly delicious. Now, those of us that have done wrong things and have had to dread confessing those wrong things to God and often to others, we know the unpleasantness, that deep pain. The price paid by Jesus for our redemption, though, was far more painful than any discomfort we ever experienced. But Lewis always owned that. He said, it cost God nothing, as far as we know, to create nice things. But to convert rebellious wills cost him crucifixion. Second thing we can learn about conversion to Christ requires a choice. Now, one of the recurrent themes in Mere Christianity is that in contrast to all the other laws of nature, such as gravity, we actually have a choice as to whether we obey the moral law or not. And after his observation about converting rebellious wills costing Jesus crucifixion, he went on to say, and because they are wills, they can, in nice people just as much as in nasty ones, refuse his request. He later wrote, the odd thing was that before God closed in on me, I was in fact offered what now appears a moment of wholly free choice. And he describes how he was riding on the top of that bus that John described to us just a few minutes ago. And he says, on the top of that bus, I became aware that I was holding something at bay or shutting something out. Or if you like, I was wearing some stiff clothing like corsets. Now, what he would know about that, I don't know. But I felt myself being there and then given a free choice. I could open the door or keep it shut. I chose to open. I say I chose, yet it did not really seem possible to do the opposite. Some theologians call that prevenient grace. Third thing we learn about conversion is conversion to Jesus requires admission that we have done wrong. And there are two foundational principles in Mere Christianity. First, there's a natural law that Chuck talked about earlier this morning, which operates in the universe, the law of right and wrong, which everyone recognizes, especially when wrong is done to them. Every moral relativist friend of mine is quick to recognize that there is actually right and wrong in the world when wrong is committed against them. But the second principle is that we have all done wrong. And he writes, Christianity will teach you that in fact you can't be good, not for 24 hours, on your own moral efforts. And then it will teach you that even if you were, you still wouldn't have achieved the purpose for which you were created. Mere morality is not the end of life. The people who keep on asking if they can't lead a decent life without Christ don't know what life is about. We are to be remade. And then Lewis insists that we must admit, we must confess that we are wrong. We have done wrong. And he says Christianity tells people to repent and promises them forgiveness. It therefore has nothing, as far as I know, to say to people who do not know they have done anything to repent of, and who do not feel that they need any forgiveness. It's after you've realized that there is a real moral law and a power behind that law, and that you have broken that law and put yourself wrong with that power. It is after all this, and not a moment sooner, that Christianity begins to talk. When you know you are sick, you will listen to the doctor. Another metaphor. Next thing we learn about conversion. Conversion to Jesus requires surrender to him. Lewis recognized that a central motivation for his atheism was his desire to be left to himself. He wrote, I had always wanted above all things not to be interfered with. I had wanted, mad wish, he says, to call my soul my own. And you'll recall in The Great Divorce, you remember when the murderer explains, I only want my rights. I'm not asking for anybody's bleeding charity. But he is urged, then do at once ask for the bleeding charity. Everything is here for the asking, and nothing can be bought. And by capitalizing bleeding charity, Lewis is making it clear what bleeding charity he is talking about. And he has stark words to say about the surrender in mere Christianity. Here's how he says it. In other words, fallen man is not simply an imperfect creature who needs improvement. He is a rebel who must lay down his arms. Laying down your arms, surrendering, saying you are sorry, realizing that you have been on the wrong track, and getting ready to start life all over again from the ground floor. That is the only way out of a hole. This process of surrender, he says, this movement full speed astern, is what Christians call repentance. Now, repentance is no fun at all. It means unlearning all the self-conceit and self-will that we've been training ourselves into for thousands of years. It means killing part of yourself, undergoing a kind of death. In fact, it needs a good man to repent. And we've had Pilgrim's Regress referred to several times, and that's one of the most beautiful pictures in all of his writing of surrender. And you remember when the pilgrim struggles with surrender, and Mother Kirk tells him to take off his rags and dive into the water. And he protests, alas, I have never learned to dive. Mother Kirk says, there's nothing to learn. The art of diving is not to do anything new, but simply to cease doing something. You have only to let yourself go. And virtue pipes up, it is only necessary, he says with a smile, to abandon all efforts at self-preservation. Surrender, Lewis recognized, is wholly unnatural to the natural man. Next thing we learn, conversion to Jesus brings new ownership. God's reconstruction of our lives after conversion can be quite unsettling, and some of you have experienced that, I'm sure. And it can be painful because we're no longer in control. My wife calls me the CEO of the world. She said, Daryl, if there's any power vacuum, you fill it immediately. Well, a personality like mine needs surrender, not just every day, every moment. Here's how Lewis compared it to remodeling a house. Imagine yourself as a living house. God comes in to rebuild that house. At first, perhaps you can understand what he's doing. He's getting the drains right and stopping the leaks in the roof and so on. You knew that those jobs needed doing, and so you're not surprised. But presently, he starts knocking the house about in a way that hurts abominably, pain again, and does not seem to make sense. What on earth is he up to? The explanation is that he is building quite a different house from the one you thought of. Throwing out a new wing here, putting on an extra floor there, running up towers, making courtyards. You thought you were going to be made into a decent little cottage, but he is building a palace. He intends to come and live in it himself. Reconstruction. The next thing we learn about conversion is, similarly, conversion to Jesus brings transformation. So not only does it bring new ownership, it brings the renovation that we've just seen described. And immediately after Lewis chose to open the door to God, he realized he was changing. Here's how he described it. I felt as if I were a man of snow at long last beginning to melt. The melting was starting in my back, drip, drip, and presently trickle, trickle. I rather disliked the feeling. Lewis believed, both because of his own experience as well as observing others, that conversion to Jesus is radical. It brings real change. He said, the regenerate man is totally different from the unregenerate. For the regenerate life, the Christ man that is formed in him transforms every part of him. In it, his spirit, soul, and body will all be reborn. And in Mere Christianity, he says, if conversion to Christianity makes no improvement in a man's outward actions, if he continues to be just as snobbish or spiteful or envious or ambitious as he was before, then I think we must suspect that his conversion was largely imaginary. When we Christians behave badly or fail to behave well, we are making Christianity unbelievable to the outside world. Next thing we learn about conversion, conversion requires intervention by Jesus himself. Now, the religious world, including many Christian churches, often promote detours, routes to the Christian life without repentance, without conversion. Jesus himself, though, spoke of the heavy cost of taking up your cross. Here's how Lewis said it. Conversion requires an alteration of the will, and an alteration which in the last resort does not occur without the intervention of the supernatural. Now, one of the big reasons why supernatural intervention is necessary is because Satan so staunchly opposes true conversion. In a letter, Lewis observed that Satan tries to interfere. He said, I think that all Christians have found that Satan is very active near the altar or on the eve of conversion. Worldly anxieties, physical discomforts, lascivious fancies, doubt are often poured in at such junctures. But the grace is not frustrated. One gets more by pressing steadily on through these interruptions than on occasions when all goes smoothly. Another thing we learn about conversion, conversion is designed to make us clean and holy. Lewis would not be impressed by the seeker-sensitive churches that are so popular in many parts of the world in their attempts to make the gospel palatable. He used direct, hard language to explain the demands of the gospel. He said this, when Jesus said, be perfect, he meant it. He meant that we must go in for the full treatment. And in that same chapter in Mere Christianity, he goes on to say it like this. The Christian way is different, harder and easier. Christ says, give me all. I don't want so much of your time and so much of your money and so much of your work. I want you. I've not come to torment your natural self, but to kill it. No half measures are any good. I don't want to cut off a branch here or a branch there. I want to have the whole tree down. Hand over the natural self, all the desires which you think innocent, as well as the ones you think wicked. The whole outfit. I will give you a new self instead. In fact, I will give you myself. My own will become yours. He went on to say, both harder and easier than what we are all trying to do. You have noticed, I expect, that Christ himself sometimes describes the Christian way as very hard and sometimes as very easy. He says, take up your cross. In other words, it's like going to be beaten to death in a concentration camp. Next minute he says, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. He means both. As Bonhoeffer put it, when Jesus calls a man, he bids him come in and die. One final thing. Conversion requires effort and perseverance. Of course, conversion is by faith, and but that doesn't mean it doesn't involve our efforts to remain in Christ. Dallas Willard often would say the fact that salvation is free through God's grace does not mean effort is not required on our part. Lewis put it like this: a Christian can lose the Christ life which has been put into him, and he has to make efforts to keep it. But even the best Christian that ever lived is not acting on his own steam. He is only nourishing and protecting a life he could never have acquired by his own efforts. So Lewis recognized that divine human synergy that is used throughout his work throughout history. So regarding his own conversion, Lewis remembers, but it is significant that this long-evaded encounter happened at a time when I was making a serious effort to obey my conscience. No doubt it was far less serious than I supposed, but it was the most serious I had made for a long time. I don't know where you are in your pilgrimage, but I hope you can learn from Lewis and from his example and from what he taught about conversion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and now it's time for a round of questions and comments, and I'm sure there is a microphone that will be given to the speakers. So, yes, please.
Thank you so much for your talks, especially concerning conversion. Recent work places the theistic conversion in 1930, work by Norbert Feindendagen and Alistair McGrath and others, and starts to look at conversion as more of a process for Lewis than I mean, it's both an event and a process, but it starts to look more of the process of that. What do you make of those recent findings, and also of perhaps evangelical ideas of conversion in contrast to maybe a more Anglican approach?
Well, first of all, on the timing, that all those details are way beyond my pay grade, and I've read both sides, and I don't think anybody actually knows what date for sure some of those events happened, because it appears that Lewis himself got the dates a little mixed up. So the date doesn't really matter in the long run anyway. And I think you've already summarized that it was a process, and that Lewis captures the moments in which he became fully aware of what had been happening in his own life. So the moment on the top of the bus that we saw a while ago, and the moment in the sidecar of the motorcycle, that was the peak. It came to the surface at that point. But I think Lewis himself was pretty straightforward that it was over time, but there did come a moment of surrender. He had to, in a moment, say yes, and that made all the difference. And we're here today because he said yes.
I think it actually requires a starting point, whatever that means for any of us. It doesn't just happen. And in my own experience, I've found there are two sorts of people. Christians, some who can remember the time, the place, the message, the event, whatever it was, very clearly, and others who can't. It's over a period of time. And that fits my own case, and I'm always a bit jealous of those who could sort of give all the basics and say, I've been there, done that, and till eventually, actually it was in my second year at university, having come to faith probably when I was 15, I was at a university mission, and it started on the Monday, and the message on the Tuesday hit me, and I said, I've got actually to do something and do it today. So although it had happened already, I needed to nail it. And for what it's worth, that was my experience. Not right or wrong, it's what was. It was a Tuesday evening.
By the way, yeah.
That's good.
Thank you. So just raise your hands and the microphone will come to you.
Check. Oh, there it goes. Okay. My question is for Dr. Jeffrey Johnson. It's actually two questions. One, to just understand better one aspect of what you said, and then the second is about the implication of where your argument might go in practical settings of how we teach literature. So the first is, you mentioned a couple of times in your talk that Trinitarian theology was very central to these authors' understanding of literature and the way they taught it. I was wondering if maybe you could unpack that more. Is that related to what you were saying? Is literature facilitating relationship? Is it close to that?
Yeah,
That's my first question.
Yeah. And simply, yes, relationship is essential. And for them as pastors themselves, as well as literary scholars, are Trinitarian understanding that is how we come to know each other, is relationship, love being God being three in one, that we cannot learn aside from story. Kind of like what we were talking about earlier, metaphor being crucial, right? We learn through story. And for them as Christians, they believe the most important story, or the most important truth, is communicated through story. The gospel we can only know through story. It's the only way. Story is relationship within words. I almost have to say within words, but it is story embodied, if you will. And so that just deepens their Trinitarian perspective, and that's part of why Morris went there, coming from a Unitarian background. Just pull them deeper and deeper and deeper into that, to look at why is it that relationship changes us. Story and relationship are inextricable. They really are the same thing, in a sense. Yeah.
Thank you. My second question was more on the practical side. I really loved the quote you shared. Literary study was a natural vehicle for both entertaining and educating the masses. Mm-hmm. In a day and age like our own, where digital media, YouTube and social media videos, are the predominant way that entertainment and education is happening, do you see a shift in the way that we teach literature, or do we need to return back to these principles, even though that is the new vehicle that's more common?
Well, I think I'd echo Lewis in his pointing out that story does not have to be attached to a certain medium. Lewis was a big fan of film. Film is a way to tell story. And I think we've certainly seen in the last 20 years how powerful story can be. I think there's probably people in this room who've only seen The Lord of the Rings and not read The Lord of the Rings. Well, I think we are in an age of visual story transforming people. Do we lose the textual story? I would argue no, that we use the visual. I think the visual can be used to pull people deeper into the text. But I do think that, maybe before I say this sentence, story is not necessarily good or bad. Story is powerful. And that's what we need to remember, is story is powerful, and it can change people, and it can change people for good, and it can change people for ill. Good story evokes story. Evokes good story. And I think that's what we need to do, whether it's visual story, oral story, acted story, danced story, or written story, that we seek to lift up and partake in and share good story. And I do think that we are called to be story stewards, not just as literature professors, but those of us who profess the Christian faith. That's a non-negotiable. We are called to be story stewards and good story. And I do think that good story evokes good story.
May I ask you a question also?
Yeah, you may,
A
Alan.
little different. If I caught correctly what you were saying that the written work should be connected back to the author. In other words, understanding better by both the written work
Or
and
it,
who.
it can, yeah.
And yet, the one thing that I have not read by C.S. Lewis yet is the Personal Heresy. Okay, which, of course, from my understanding of it, he kind of makes a disconnect between the work itself and the person who wrote it. So I just wonder if you can kind of make any kind of comparison or analysis there.
Yeah, I'm not going to be able to speak as well as I want on this. I have some friends who've done some work on this who could parse it out much better for you. And I think I think we sometimes misunderstand what Lewis is saying there, and kind of we make it too broad and sweep it away. All we have to do is look at Lewis's own writing himself when he is pointing us to other authors, pointing us to Spencer, pointing us to MacDonald. Lewis is writing at a time where people are delving into, I think, what Lewis himself would feel like unnecessary, he would say uncomfortable facts about their life that is not lending to understanding the text better. I think, in short summary, the best way I can explain that is during Lewis's lifetime, the first piece of literary criticism written on George MacDonald was written by a Jungian scholar from Harvard. No, Yale scholar. He gave the lecture at Harvard. And he actually admitted that his whole lecture and then the book that was based on it called The Golden Key was actually written to tick off Lewis. The whole book was about MacDonald, but it was a Freudian reading of MacDonald. And everything in MacDonald, from his perspective, was a phallic symbol, and a lot of his thesis is based on the fact that because MacDonald was denied his mother's breast milk, you can understand, through knowing that fact, you can understand everything that MacDonald wrote. And the whole first 30 years of MacDonald's scholarship is shaped by that Freudian perspective, which then eventually a lot of the critics go, that's a little much, and they shift into a Jungian reading and don't look at the actual biography of MacDonald. They pull out little facts and do psychoanalysis through these odd facts instead of looking at the whole corpus. And I think actually if we look at Lewis's work himself, we realize that just that example shows the difference of what he's pushing against as opposed to what he was comfortable with.
Nice clarification. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
I have a question for Dr. Lotz. Thank you, first of all, for the wonderful tour that you gave us by taking us to Oxford and to Haddington. And now the question, you mentioned in your paper the term joy a few times, and it was not very obvious whether you use it in the Lewisian sense as used in Surprised by Joy, or whether you made a switch or a transition to joy as a Christian virtue. Because if I recall correctly, Lewis does not speak of joy in terms of Christian experience, because he mentions it, obviously, as you all know, as an experience that he had prior to conversion, and which was an arrow pointing to God. So it's something that occurred in childhood with that famous biscuit tin that covered with moss that evoked the joy of paradise. So I wonder in what sense you use joy, and whether you deliberately left it a bit ambiguous. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a word that can be used very loosely, and I think I was caught for time, as you might have been aware. There are other things and one of the things I was going to say about joy is eventually he met one and married her. which brought a new dynamic to his life. And it is a bit like that. We enter into, and joy is subjective. Don't be embarrassed about that. Life is subjective. And it's part of the way we're made. Also, joy is part of the fruit of the Spirit. It is a gift of God, and he transforms, as it were, a philosophical concept into a living dynamic. So there are all those sorts of ways of looking. It's only a word when all's said and done, and what's its context. And it's quite obvious all the way along in his in Surprised by Joy. He is looking for something as a young man, as an undergraduate and all the rest. He is looking for something that's important to him as an individual in his life. And he wasn't finding it in where he was looking. He was looking in drugs, he was looking in sex, he was looking in philosophy, he was looking everywhere and not finding it until, as it were, joy met him in the bus and subsequently. And it isn't a sit back and enjoy it, it's a participating thing. It goes back to conversion and what we were looking at a few minutes ago. It doesn't happen at you. It happens with you and in you. Don't be afraid of subjectivity. We're subjective animals.
I'd like to thank all of the speakers so far for their illuminating thoughts and inspiration. Thank you, all of you. This is a question for Professor Dr. John Lotz, who I do know quite well. But John, as an intellectual man and as a very practical man, I'd like to ask you, what impact has Lewis's thoughts and writing had on your life, please?
Don't be scared to think. And Lewis was a great thinker, but you can make thinking rather woolly. There are different ways of looking at it, and asking questions is hugely important. To my mind, there are two sorts of questions. One where you don't want to find an answer, you want to find an excuse. And the other way you do find an answer so you can do something. And so we can get confused with ordinary words because we can look at them in different ways. Lewis, if you like, is a breath of fresh air who says you don't have to be afraid to think big thoughts, because if they're aimed at a big God, you're going to get big answers. And be ready for it. Don't play with God.
This question is also for Professor Lotz. How do you see, John, the link between joy and Sehnsucht or immortal longings in Lewis?
Between what and Genesis?
The joy and Sehnsucht or the immortal longings in Lewis.
Sorry, I'm not getting into the question.
Do you not understand the word Sehnsucht, the immortal longings?
Yeah.
It's a very common theme in Lewis.
Yeah.
And he had it all his life, and long before he experienced his conversion of joy. How do you see those two linked, those ideas?
I don't know how qualified I am to answer that question. Maybe I need time to think about it.
Okay, that's all right.
But thank you anyway. I'll see you later, Jim. Just to say that Jim and Janet are here for the first time, and they go to the same church that I go to.
Kirstin again.
I have a question,
The last question.
for the prof.
Yes,
I didn't
please.
get the name, sorry. You say one time that we have to kill something in ourselves. Call it evil inclination, let's say. But do we really kill it, or just another metaphor, we are riding the donkey?
Well, I think I think St. Paul would agree with Lewis that yes, we have to kill it. There's a surrender, and that's our act of dying to ourselves. But of course, it's back to prevenient grace working in our lives. We can only do that as the Spirit assists us to let go of our depraved natures. But I think Lewis would make it he always spoke of it as an act that he had to commit. And I think that's very much in line with Paul, and especially Romans 6 through 8. Yeah.
Let Kirstin have the last word, please.
I think my mind is popping back to Alan's question, because I think I failed to answer it fully, and I think maybe it applies to why it is important to look at Lewis's life as well. And that is because of the Freudian Jungian focus on MacDonald. People assumed that he was anti-Christian. When I started as a scholar, you weren't allowed to talk about MacDonald's faith at all. You weren't allowed to write a paper on or give a paper at a conference about how he engages with Scripture, because he was seen as an anti-Christian icon, definitely an anti-church icon, which is really hard if you've read MacDonald's work to understand, right? It's a great example of not taking, because scholars felt that you didn't need to know the story of the author. They could just read a single text and come up with their own perspective on the writing, and not look at his life story. When he's a pastor, he's supporting Christians, he's spiritual confidant to people struggling with faith, his sermons, all his stories. And so you could avoid that and just have your own perspective, your own idea. And so failing to to have respect for the person, for the author of a text, can actually, we put ourselves in the position of God, really. We decide what the person is saying, and we don't enter community and relationship. And I think for Lewis scholarship, that continues to be important, to look at the whole corpus, to actually take parts of his life into consideration, to recognize that this is a living person who engaged with people, and then we do better scholarship, both on the page and the conferences, when we engage with each other, and we recognize that this is not just something on the page, but a whole person, and a whole person who is an apologist, a whole person who is a neighbor, a whole person who is a literature scholar, who is a medieval and Renaissance passionate person, who loved fairy tale, who was Irish. If we don't pull all of those things in, we misread Lewis, right? We misrepresent Lewis, and we don't understand the apologist Lewis if we don't pay attention to the literary scholar, if we don't pay attention to the Irish Lewis. And I think, well, I'm quite confident that Lewis would agree with me on that.
Thank you for concluding our panel so gloriously. We now deserve a full meal. Okay, time for lunch.